All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Excess Exceed. This is Gearface. Today, I am joined by Jay. Jay, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Super excited to talk to you about this character. For people who don't know Jay, and please correct me if I'm wrong. He's been out of the Exceed community or maybe not the Exceed community, but he's been out of tournament play of Exceed for a little while now. But back in season 1 and season 2, uh, my understanding is that you were a terror.
I just played a whole bunch of games, and that adds up.
If you say so. I've heard some stories about some tournaments that you may have won. I think you're being a little bit modest. But yeah, for people who don't know, Jay's a very, very good player, and I'm very, very excited to have him here telling me about Luciya. Really excited to learn a little bit about this character, as is my new standard for talking about season 1 and season 2 characters. I've deliberately not looked at anything in this kit, so I'm going to be totally surprised about what she's got going on. So I'm entirely in Jay's hands here. Um, Couple disclaimers before we get started. Number one, as always, we're going to be playing to win on this show. We're going to be talking about playing to win. That's not the only way to play Exceed. You can play Exceed for fun. I encourage you to play Exceed for fun because you'll have fun doing it. With these characters in particular, playing to win might be a little bit more complicated than you think because they've rotated out of competitive play. So if you are looking to take Luciya to a tournament, you might not be able to outside of certain legacy events. That doesn't mean that the advice that we're giving won't be relevant to upping your game with her, but it does mean that, we don't really know how she fares against season 7. She's never been in competitive play at the same time as them. So, keep that in mind before you go bringing her to your local. And then disclaimer number 2, Exceed is not a solved game. I'm not an expert at all. I claim to know nothing. Jay is an expert, but even his opinion is just a very informed one. Take all of the absolute strategy advice that we're about to receive on this lesson. All of the always do this, never do that. This is always a boost. This is always an attack. All that stuff. Take it with a grain of salt. Develop your own playstyle with this character. Don't rely on just our word for it. That said, season 2 in particular was in competitive rotation for a very long time, and people know a lot about these characters and how they work. So, that doesn't mean that we know everything, but these characters in particular, I think that there's a very good body of evidence for how they work. And to explain that body of evidence, I'm going to kick it over to Jay. So, Jay, please tell me a little bit about Luciya.
Well, Lucia is one of those characters where the character ability really changes what she does and what she wants to do.
Okay.
We'll just start with the front side because that's already an entire character in itself without even looking at the exceed.
Okay.
So you basically ping the opponent for 1 damage when you cross over them, and you add the top card of your discard pile to your gauge. And that right there already gives you a ton of resource acceleration. Just throughout the game, anything you do that moves you past the opponent uh, is going to add to your gauge. And that
Okay.
doesn't include pulling the opponent past you. You have to be the one moving past the opponent. And it doesn't include the opponent forcing you to move past them. So it has to be advances, advanced movements, basically.
Okay. So your grasp doesn't work for this, but your dive would.
Dive absolutely works.
Okay.
Um,
What about
so
I'm sorry to interrupt. What about just the move action? Not saying that you should, but if you just boosted cross and ran past the opponent, does that work?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's
Okay.
you're in the corner, opponent's cornered you. You run past them, and also they've been punished for cornering you because they take a damage and you gain a gauge.
Okay. Interesting. So you are dealing a little bit of damage during strikes. Does that damage contribute to a stun?
Yeah, if the cards have been revealed and you're activating the text on the cards in the strike, then that crossover damage does contribute towards stun. It contributes towards reducing their armor. Um, But the crossover damage itself cannot kill them. So the last bit of damage you do has to be from the
From a strike
damage number on
itself.
the card. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay. And the fact that you led with this gives you resource acceleration, not this gives you damage.
Right.
I think I should be reading into that a little bit. That's the important part of this. That I'm getting gauge for whenever I do this.
They're actually both very useful. But the resource acceleration is the thing you should be thinking about how that changes your playstyle and how that changes your strategy. Since damage is something that you want to do no matter which character you're playing.
Oh, fair point. Yeah, I that's generally my plan with any character I'm playing. But okay, so
Right.
so Luciya is special among the ways that she's special is that she's getting this acceleration for doing otherwise kind of like neutral or maybe even costly game actions.
Right. And you
Okay.
should generally expect to build up gauge very quickly, maybe even have, 8 or 9 gauge before either player is below 10 health.
Okay.
And that you have to think, if you have all that gauge, how is that changing your plans? How's that changing the type of actions you're taking?
Okay. So I'm gonna in all likelihood have a pretty serious resource advantage over my opponent. Is she the kind of character who's going? I guess this is maybe for later in the lesson, but is she the kind of character who's going to be hoarding that gauge, or is she going to be kind of spending it incrementally as we go here?
It kind of depends on where you're at in the game and what you're envisioning for the end game. So this is very much a character where you want to have a plan. You want to have a kind of a idea in your mind of where you're going to be by the time you win.
Okay.
You don't just want to play by the seat of your pants. So sometimes you'll want to hoard gauge, sometimes you want to spend it. But if you don't know what you're doing with your gauge, that's probably a sign that you should be spending it on something.
Okay. So yeah, if I've got 9 gauge and I lost the game, I probably should
Yeah,
have spent that.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
That's a sign that maybe I made a misplay somewhere with my
Yeah, it's
resources.
not doing anything if it just sits there the entire game without being spent.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. All right, so I'm assuming then that throughout her kit, outside of just the normals, she's got plenty of ways to trigger this ability.
So each, or not each, but a lot of her specials trigger it. Her ultras can both trigger it. Um, and again, you can just trigger it with the move action. So, for
Right.
example, if I've got Luciya
Here,
here and an opponent standing right
I've
next
got
to her,
a training dummy right here for you.
I spend one ultra from hand to it goes to discard. I move across, and boom, I do her
Deal a
damage, and
damage, and
goes.
it immediately goes to gauge. Okay.
And then if I want to burn a turn because I'm in this position where I want to stall, and there's nothing the opponent can really do to punish stalling, I can just ping him for damage, move across, and he goes right back to gauge.
Okay. That makes sense. And in the and yeah, and that's like resource neutral for you, because it was coming from gauge, it was going from gauge. That just took a turn.
Yep,
Okay. And
absolutely.
in the meta that Luciya was kind of competitively active in, that grindier, stallier playstyle was a little bit more supported. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that optimally, you want to be able to stall when it benefits you, and you want to be able to explode when it benefits you. And I think most of the really high tier characters like Renea and Zolt and Luciya all had stall options and explosive options that they could switch between.
Okay, so Luciya could, if the situation if she was afforded the situation and the opportunity to, just like win by inches by just pinging you over and over again and saying you have to
Right.
do something about this. But
If the
she does.
opponent if the opponent is just scared of you and they're not going to put pressure on you and they're not going to try to win, then you can just kind of like drag the game out and let them die.
Okay, makes sense. And then it sounds like she does have some explosive options. Do we want to get into the kit itself and talk about how this all works, or should we talk about her exceed mode as well?
Let's look at her individual cards and how that's going to work with her friend ability, and then we'll look at the exceed mode and how that changes everything.
Sure, sounds good. So, and as we're setting these up here, one thing to mention for people who aren't used to seventh cross characters and their transforms here. If you see this black border or black background, white text on the bottom of these cards, um, these are things that Luciya is going to get. They're basically, think of them like permanently installed boosts that will, if she lands one of these attacks, they will just be on the board for the rest of the game.
Yes, and you can get these either by hitting with the attack itself and then it installs, or if you have 2 copies of it in your hand, you can EX transform and gain it permanently that way.
Right. Okay.
It's also important to note that it will reduce your exceed cost by 2 for each one you have in play. So it starts with an exceed cost of 5. That's
right.
not necessarily an obstacle for her because she does have very easy gauge generation, but cheaper exceed's good.
Right. Makes sense. And the more transforms you have, the cheaper it'll be. And as we're talking about the transforms and as we figure out what they do to her game plan, we can talk about maybe EX transforming and whether that's, you know, whether that's
Right.
the right call or when you want to do that kind of thing. But yeah, whatever special you want to start with.
All right, so let's just start with the ones that have boost on them, the regular
Sure.
specials, basically.
Sounds good.
One thing I'm going to note about Luciya is she tends to be very fast. So that's going to kind of inform what her card's values are. And if you see Firefly Gunner, this breaks the rule of being very fast. It's a speed 1.
Right.
But it is also a range dodge. So it dodges at range 3 to 4, which means this becomes one of her primary mix-up options. So she's forecasting a lot of times that she wants to go first. She wants to hit the opponent before they can do anything, and then either stun them out or move somewhere where they can't hit her.
Right.
And they're going to be tempted to play defensively, and then Firefly Gunner will counter a lot of those defensive options.
Sure, that makes sense.
So if you're holding this card in hand, they have to suddenly be thinking very carefully about what's safe and what's not.
And
Firefly
also,
Gunner importantly beats Spike and Sweep at range 3. So range 3, you have a very strong mix-up in terms of what you can do.
And also, looking at the rest of her kit here, I'm seeing 2, 2, 4, 2, 6 is a lot. This is a punishing mix-up option then.
Yeah, 6 hurts. 6 is it's basically a sweep that dodges instead of trades.
That seems pretty good. And obviously, close up, there's not much you're doing with this. I'm noticing that this doesn't move you or the opponent, so you're not getting your ability out of it. But this is just like everything else in her kit is going to make me be able to land this, basically.
Yeah. Firefly Gunner is you can't actually predict me as long as it's not down. Which means sometimes it's better to have Firefly Gunner in your deck so the opponent doesn't know what you're doing with it.
Sure. It kind of has the same. It enables the same play patterns as like if you have like a range 1 Spike in your kit or something, like they need to know that it's there so that you can hit with your other stuff sometimes.
Yeah. And then, of course, the other side of it is slow attack, fast boost. So +3 speed with 0 force cost. That's insanely good.
That's ridiculous.
The catch is that at the end of your next turn, it becomes Gauge. And you would think free Gauge is pretty nice, but again, that's not necessarily a problem for Luciya. You usually want to capitalize on that speed boost.
Right.
So it is a +3 speed with the catch that if the opponent finds some way to change the situation so that's not going to win you the strike, it might just be a free Gauge, which is not great, or it might be a much less enticing +3 speed.
Right. Okay.
But it's usually extremely good and very hard for the opponent to beat if you play it correctly.
Makes sense. And then I assume then that the importance of Firefly Gunner as a threat means that boosting the Whirlwind needs to be weighed against that opportunity cost. But maybe like the first one that comes up, I can boost, and the second one I should really be careful about giving up because that means that the threat is gone.
I would say that boosting this means that it's going to pay out in some way. Because if you're just taking a gamble on whether the opponent can counter it and it doesn't pay out, that means you just lost a Firefly Gunner.
Right, that makes sense. And also, so at the end of your next turn gives you your opponent's turn, which means that they have to strike into you at +3 speed, which can be, I mean, hey, I'll take a bugger of range 3
that's generally ideal.
That sounds fine.
If you can force them to strike into you at +3 speed, it's very hard to explain why you would lose that strike.
Definitely. Or
much more likely is they will counter boost or they will move to a position where they don't think you have a good option.
Okay, so they counter boost, and now the onus is on me as the decision maker to capitalize on this, or
or to let it go to Gauge, and
allow it to go to Gauge, and be kind of sad about that.
Yeah,
I gotcha. Okay, and hopefully my hope is that they can't do as much as +3 speed would do in a single boost. That this is actually pretty hard to stop.
And in fact, there's extremely few people who can do that.
Right. And for people who are a little bit more used to current meta Exceed, where +1 speed or kind of numbers were bigger back then, but numbers weren't this big. Like +3 speed, even in 7th cross meta, is a lot.
Yes, +3 speed with 0 force cost, that's definitely an outlier.
Yeah, that's crazy, even back then. Okay, cool. So this mix-up option, really strong boost. That makes sense.
Yeah. This is making your spikes beat Assault outright and beat Trass if Trass is played on the defense side.
Yep.
So this is just saying I win the next strike unless you do something about it.
Right. Okay. So tons and tons of, like, I'm sure that we can find something to do with this +3 speed somewhere among our strong normals. Like there's going to be ways to do it. That makes sense. Okay.
Absolutely. All right. Next we have Downburst. Downburst is going to be, well, there's going to be a theme with Luciya where her cards don't necessarily do what you think they do when you read them.
Okay.
And in this case, you see this says before pull 2, after advance 2. So what this means naturally is that if you are at range 3, you pull them into them, and then you hit them, and then you move past them to ping them for that 1 damage.
Right.
So this is an above curve option.
Okay, so this is actually probably a range 2 or range 3 attack.
Well, and then we're still on Luciya's front side, so what you actually do, if the opponent has not played against Luciya before and you just want to do something really cheap, you play it at range 4, you pull the opponent over here, and you ping them for 1 damage. And whatever they thought was their fast option got stunned out.
Okay, so it's above curve anyway at 3.
Yeah.
But it's also a very mean above like well above curve, super above curve option at 4. Where I'm not hitting, but I'm kind of hitting, and I'm getting gauge anyway, even though this isn't going to gauge.
Yeah, you're getting gauge, you're getting that 1 damage, you're stunning out things that don't have guard or armor on it.
Okay, interesting. So I can kind of treat this as being like it's a range 2 to 4 speed 6, but at range 4 it does 1 damage instead of 2.
Yeah.
Okay, and it puts a different card in my gauge.
It also does like weird things if someone's cornered. So, pull 2, I don't hit. Advance 2, I ping for damage, but I get us both out of the corner, which might be something I want to do.
Right. Okay. So this is a move both of you tool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but mostly it sounds like a very above curve defensive option.
Correct.
Okay.
And then we want to look at its boost real quick. 2 force cost. To advance your retreat as far as possible, if you move past the opponent, add this to your gauge. So the classic use case is you are cornered, you use this boost, you play probably an ultra for the other 2 force.
Right.
You move past the opponent all the way over here. You add the card that you just spent as force to gauge because you move past them, and then you add this card to gauge as well.
Gauge too.
So it's basically force neutral at that point.
As long as the thing I'm putting into my gauge is the ultra that I'm spending, it's going to be force neutral. And okay,
you can just spend 2 other things, and you only lose 1 force to move all the way across the entire battle.
The entire range of the field. Okay, so that's really, really force efficient.
Yeah, and Luciya really wants to be at range 5, maybe 6 sometimes. So being range 7 is not ideal, but lots of opponents really don't want to be long range either. So it's forcing them to make the decision next on how they're going to change that.
Sure. I mean, even some like I'm not sure I would call Ryu over here, our training dummy, like a dedicated zoner, but he's good at range, and he has nothing that hits at range 7. Like there are some characters who are I would characterize as being like range monsters who are like range 6 is kind of where they cap out. So getting that far away from them actually is pretty rare.
Yep. So that's kind of she's a transform character, so she only has 2 specials that have boost on them. Those are both of those specials.
Okay.
And we've seen that both of those have some pretty good stuff on them. An above curve and a mix-up option with very good speed and very good movement on them.
In terms of evaluating downburst versus chain climb and like when you would use either one, are you when we were talking about Firefly Gunner, it was kind of we had sort of more prescriptive advice about that. Are you just kind of using chain climb when you need to and using downburst when you need a defensive option?
Downburst is there. It's a little bit more niche, but it's absolutely fantastic if you need to get out of the corner, or if you need to run to the corner, or any other situation where you need to move a lot of distance. It's also great for that above curve option, but it's probably not the key card in your strategy. It's just an extra option that's a little bit strong.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about Bug Zapper next. This is going to be our first transform card.
Sure. Where did our other transform cards go?
I put them away for
there they
a
are.
second. Yeah.
I got you. Just making sure. Okay.
So Bug Zapper is an excellent question for what do you do when you're at this long range and you need something to follow up with. So it's 1/2/4, which is a bad stat line. This is probably the only attack in her deck that's quote unquote bad, but it's not really. You spend up to 4 force, and for each force spent, you advance 2. So if I spend 4 force, then I would advance 8.
Right.
1, 2, 3, and then advance into the corner, basically.
Right.
So this is my long range option. This is the only card I have that hits at range 7 and 8 by default.
Okay.
Um,
and I'm paying a lot. I'm paying a lot for that privilege.
Oh, yeah.
Though. That's 4 force.
Yeah, and there is a way you can make that 4 force work for you in a different circumstance, which is you can use this as a bit of a mid speed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm at range 2. Now speed 4 is definitely below curve.
Right.
But if I just want to get in some cheeky damage, I spend 4 force. I go 1, that's a ping and a gauge. 2, that's a ping and a gauge. 3, that's a ping and a gauge, and I stop here and hit them with it.
Okay, which would give you 2 more damage and another gauge. So all right, so because each individual advance is always calculated toward the target. So I wouldn't go 1
each advance
force,
is
2 force, 3 force. I would always ping back towards them.
Yeah, the way this works mechanically is you spend all 4 force at once, but you do each advance 2 separately.
Gotcha. Okay. And so, if I did all of that, I'm doing 6 damage, which as mid speeds go, I'm not stunning sweep or anything like that. But I also did just get so much gauge.
Yeah, you either moved a bunch of stuff from your hand into gauge, or maybe you played some ultras for that force and went plus on gauge.
Right.
So you generally it doesn't typically win strikes, but it does make you lose them less, and it gives you a transform, which lowers your exceed cost.
Okay. And normally when we're talking about on previous lessons, we've been talking about, you would call this like a Rekka effect, where you're spending to a break point. If I've got something that beats a Tatsu, I would spend 3 force on that to hit 5 power or something. Because I'm getting gauge as well out of this expense, should I normally be spending as much as I can on Bug Zapper?
Depends. I'd say like if the opponent plays a block and you're already next to them, it can be fine just to say, all right, well, I'll just hit with the default effect because I don't want to spend stuff that you're going to block cheaper than what I spent it on.
Oh, okay. But I'm not going to be able to spend enough to like break a sweep, for example.
Exactly.
But
you're not going to break sweep. You're not going to break focus unless you have some other shenanigans going on.
Right. But I might want to spend up to that break point anyway, even if I'm not going to break it, because I want the gauge.
Yeah.
That's an evaluation I can make.
And in fact, like if you have a life lead and you're just going for the knockout, this brings you closer to that knockout. So go ahead and spin stuff.
Okay.
That's sometimes a valid evaluation. And it really just depends on what your resources are like and what you have versus what you don't have.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. But like I said, a lot of times you either play this because it'll close you in efficiently and they'll set you up for your next turn, especially if the opponent initiates at long range thinking that they can just play a safe block and not give you any resources off of it.
Right.
Or you're trying to get transform out because you want to reduce that exceed cost to make it a little bit more attractive to exceed.
Okay.
And I do not say you play it generally to get the transform effect itself, because the transform effect is a little bit tricky. You have this, your normal attacks have after. If the opponent is stunned, move 2. And there's several things about this that you want to keep in mind is that first, it's not optional. You have to do the move 2 if they are stunned.
Oh, okay.
And this will cause broken game states more than anything else in her kit. You will hit with that sweep after they grasp you, and you're not even thinking about whether it's stunned because it doesn't matter most of the time. But it did, and you are forced to move 2 now. And if you forget to do that, then that's broken game state.
Because the stun can happen reactively. Most of the time when we're playing Exceed, the only time stunning matters is if you still have an attack coming up in the queue. But this is just, if you stun them anytime, you're moving.
Yeah. So the most obvious benefit from this is that on your front side, you stun them with a normal, and then you move across them after you stun them to ping them for 1 more damage. You get 1 more gauge.
Right.
And that's pretty good. But again, the big issue with this is it's just so hard to remember that you have it. So it's easy to make plays without even factoring in what this will do to that play.
Right. And also, I might not want to move. If I'm in a situation where I want to hold that position, I do have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. The classic example would be I play cross, and I'm out at range 4, and this is actually really good for me. But now this is saying, well, the opponent tried to wild swing and got like an assault or whatever. Well, now I'm either going to range 6, which I don't have stuff that hits natively here except for Bug Zapper, and I've already got one copy down as a transform, so I'm probably not counting on the other one.
Right.
Or I'm at range 2, which is fine if I have another cross in hand, but I might not. And these are both positions that Luciya is not super happy to be in usually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this transform like it doesn't sound like you're saying that it's bad necessarily. It sounds like you're saying that it's kind of finicky. Is this
It is difficult to play with because it's difficult to remember that you have to think about it all the time.
okay? That's fair.
Yeah.
I know that you do have the option when you're playing a 7th cross character to just allow a transformable card to go to Gauge instead. Would you recommend that I transform this card in order to reduce my Exceed mode cost, even if I'm not really planning on getting the most out of its effect, as long as I think that I can remember to do it?
Yeah, I'd say as long as you're on Frontside, Luciya, this card gives you enough value in terms of that crossover ping damage that you wanted either for that or for the Exceed reduction. I'd say once you've exceeded, we're going to talk about what your game plan there is. But once you've exceeded, any future Bug Zappers you land should go to Gauge.
Should just go to Gauge. That makes sense. Okay, cool.
All right. Let's see. Let's go to the next transform we have on the next transform attack we have on the list. We have this Mantis Strike. This is your 3 to 5, and this is showing off part of why we really like range 3 to 5. We already saw the 3 to 4 is pretty good because of that range dodge.
Right.
Now we have a somewhat on-curve attack at 3 to 5. And this is going to be a hit, pull 2, advance 4, which changes drastically what you do depending on where you are on the board and where the opponent is on the board. So if I'm doing a positioning like this, pull 2, advance 4, does 1, 2, 3, 4, puts me right back at range 4, makes it very hard for a lot of counterattacks to hit me like sweep, puts me in a good position to play other stuff like Firefly Gunner. On the other hand, if I'm over here at range 5, pull 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is a little bit of an awkward position. Opponent, if they're melee, they probably like this a little bit more.
Right.
But I mean, hitting at range 5 with a speed 4 is not bad. Like lots of characters don't have great options at range 5, and this is a good way to just get 4 damage on them if they don't have any defensive stuff to play.
So this is kind of balanced around the fact that it sounds like I would prefer to play it most of the time in terms of upside when it's slightly under curve and slightly unsafe.
Yeah, it does a little bit. It beats some more stuff when more stuff beats it, I guess.
Sure.
Is a
Right.
way to put it.
Yeah. You can either play it super, super safe and run a risk of running into something, or play it slightly below curve and dodge a sweep in some positions.
Yeah, and of course, this next part I'm going to show you is why I would advocate for playing this at the safe way, not the unsafe way.
Okay.
We get this transform. When you initiate a strike, you can spend 2 force. If you do, move 1.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to point out the really cheeky kind of gimmick play here is to spend 2 force from Gauge, like an Ultra, to move past them and do 1 damage, and then you play your strike.
And then you strike them, right?
Yeah, so it's like it doesn't contribute to stun value, but you get to do 1 damage and strike, so that's always fun.
And you got your Gauge back if you put an Ultra
Yeah,
down.
exactly.
Okay.
But the of course much more valuable use of this is that move 1 and strike means you suddenly don't care about your positioning as much being bad because you can make it good and strike on the same turn.
Right. Okay. So I can fix that little problem where I'd rather be at range 3 than range 2 and not give up tempo to do it.
Yeah. So remember this +3 speed boost we mentioned earlier? So I play this at, say, range 3 because I want to spike, and the opponent's an intelligent Ryu. He just steps in 1. Normally that'd be kind of annoying because I don't necessarily love my position here as much because his cross.
And he would be threatening sure you can even with a 6-speed spike, you're not necessarily being totally free here.
Yeah.
But boop, and now suddenly you are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, the much more and this is odd for most characters, but you will play +2 speed at range 1 a lot of the time. because there's something that we'll get to in a second we want to hit at range 1 with. And the opponent just scoots back 1. And it's like, well, I'm still at +3 speed. Spike is actually still pretty good here.
Right.
But I don't get the attack I wanted.
Right.
I might not have Spike in hand.
So this fixes unreactably something that you want to do. So I guess I have 2 questions about this. Number one, I haven't gotten a sense, other than how much crazy gauge she gets, I haven't gotten a sense of Luciya's economy yet. How pricey is 2 force for her?
2 force on her front side, it's not a cost at all. Again, you just pay an ultra from gauge, and you will typically get it back by moving past them at some point in the strike.
Okay. And at some point earlier in the game, I probably paid an ultra for a force cost and got it for chain climb, for example, and got it engaged that way. I can just recycle that resource for a while.
Yeah, you will. On front side, resources are not an issue. On Exceed side, again, it's a new character. We'll talk about that when we get there.
Right. Okay. The second question I had for Storm's Fury, for the transform here, you mentioned wanting to play this when it is safe, so that you are getting the most value you can out of the transform. In the past, I have had lessons on characters like Joffrey and Jeanette, who have this like game warping transform that like you play it as safe as possible, and that's still not safe enough. You EX that transform for you EX Joffrey's counterspell, or you don't play it at all. Is it that important that I get Storm's Fury for Luciya, or can I just throw this at range 5 and be pretty okay with it?
It really depends on what options the opponent has. If you are very confident that you're going to win a strike with this and just do more damage than the opponent does to you, I think it's probably fine to throw it. This is not necessarily you don't need this card to win.
Okay,
but you definitely want
I guess
this card.
That was my question. Like with those other characters that I mentioned, like their game plan, like fighting Joffrey with that transform versus fighting Joffrey without that transform, those are different matchups. This is just like a really good thing to have. It's not like her whole game plan.
Yeah. To put it another way, you really want to EX transform this card if you get a chance to.
Okay.
Like early game, EX transforming this would be massive. But you don't hold a copy into this card in your hand for 10 turns, hoping you'll draw the other one to EX transform it either.
I gotcha.
You want to find some way to get value out of it.
That makes sense. Okay. Cool. All right. And am I mulliganing for this transform to try to hit with it, or is it just like a if it comes up awesome kind of thing?
Mulliganing for this is a decent option, especially since it's a good range 4 option just if you're on first player.
Sure.
If you're going second, I would not necessarily mulligan for this because it doesn't beat dive and it doesn't beat a lot of other stuff the opponents can do at range 4 and turn 1.
Right. Fair enough.
I would generally mulligan for Downburst or Firefly Gunner, more commonly than I would mulligan for Mantis Strike.
Okay.
Just because that turn 1 that range 4, just winning a strike outright is more valuable.
Right. Okay. Sounds good.
Do keep in mind that this is on-demand force spend for some effect when you initiate a strike. That'll come up again later.
Okay, so I've got some kind of like force sync in my kit. Okay, it's going to be one of those characters.
We're noticing that Luciya builds up a lot of gauge, and one of the things you can do with it is spend a lot of gauge for something else later on.
Okay, cool. All right, that makes sense. Where to next?
All right, our last special is going to be the Talon Sweep, and this is going to be the third card we've looked at that has an effect that you probably read incorrectly.
I know this card. I have heard about the Talon Sweep test. So this is a hit effect.
This is a hit effect. This advance 4 does not happen unless you hit the opponent. So it only hits at range 1.
This is not a range 5 above curve option. This is a range 1 below curve option. Okay.
Yeah, this is a slow grasp, basically.
Okay.
Or a short range cross, if you think of it. But you hit with it, you advance 4. So again, we're going to ping that extra damage. This actually says it's power 3. Only time it's not power 3 is if the opponent has cornered themselves.
Okay.
In which case, this becomes not a good attack.
Right. Don't do it then. Just play cross instead.
Yeah, maybe. So yeah, this is power 3 by default normally, and then you can also spend +1 force to make it power 4. not necessarily something you need to do because Advance 4 puts you out of range of a lot of stuff they do.
Right.
But if they have some kind of cross catcher that has only 3 guard, which there are characters that do that, Selinka comes to mind.
Okay,
This
yeah, true.
says even cross catchers don't work sometimes.
Yeah, so like the common sort of like guard breakpoint would be 4 for like a Tatsu for Ryu or something like that. But there are characters who only have 3 guard on something, and you can mess with them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. And then the ability, the transform on here, I would say is probably her most powerful transform.
Okay.
And it doesn't look like much, but it's very good. When you set your attack, you can spend 1 force, and if you do, both players have +1 power. If you remember Akuma, this is kind of like a lightweight version of Akuma's thing, where he spends a gauge to give both players +2 power.
Yes.
And so you're going to follow a lot of the same logic you would with Akuma there. You don't use this to actually give the opponent power. You use this to just beat them outright.
Right. And
So
this works on offense. This works on defense. I can do it unreactably, and I can do it
Yeah.
when I'm sure I'm going to win with something.
Absolutely. Yeah, this
Okay.
is like a crit effect, except you can pay from your hand.
Okay. So if I have where do we put our +3 speed? Where did that go?
On Firefly Gunner.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, thank you. If we've got the whirlwind in play, and we're like, awesome, I got dive in hand, I got spike in hand, hit me.
Yep.
Even on defense, I'm probably going to win that strike. Cool. I'll have +1 power on top of that.
Yeah, you got something else that's unbeatable like cross. It's like, yeah, just +1 power cross. Why not?
Okay.
Yeah, so it's very good effect. And given Luciya has lots of stuff that either dodges or moves people into places they're not supposed to be, you can generally set up a lot of stuff that you expect to just not get hit back on, or maybe even with.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
So in terms of like how I'm, I guess, like triaging these transforms, it sounds like the 2 that I'm really looking for to get into play are Grandstanding and Storm's Fury. I would also accept Thunderclap, but it's finicky.
Thunderclap is good on Frontside Luciya if you have the bandwidth to actually think about it all the time.
Right. Sure. Which will matter, especially for things like tournament play, where you're really trying to you're trying to think about tactics, not about rules.
Yeah.
Right.
Grandstanding is the transform I would definitely want to EX. I would not ever want to play this card unsafe.
Okay.
I might sometimes decide to standing in against my opponent when they're in the corner, and I know they have sweep in hand, and I will still play it if I know that it's gonna hit for sure, because it might be worth more than the 4-6 damage I just took from that sweep.
Okay, so Grandstanding can be that important to get online to up my power when I need it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can get out Grandstanding soon, it's probably going to be a much easier game than if it's a struggle to get out, or if you whiff it entirely.
Okay, that all makes sense.
All right, let's look at these ultras. These are some of the strongest ultras in the game, which is, I'm not sure I can say that because Season 1 and Season 2 both have lots of strongest ultras in the game.
Right.
This is definitely in that category.
They're in contention for it.
So let's start with Ride the Lightning. This is 2 gauge, which Luciya has 0 trouble getting, but you do want to make sure you always do have at least 2 gauge, just because you want to threaten this card so much of the time.
Right.
This is 118, which is, it's going to outspeed most stuff, and it has close 4 as a before effect. So it's just massively above curve for pretty much the entire board.
Yeah. Even at range 1, this is above curve.
And then to add insult to injury, it's after advance force, so you ping them for that 1 extra damage. It's actually a 128, and you regain 1 of the gauges you spent on it.
Okay.
Yeah. This is a defensive tool more than anything. You use this to diffuse boost setups that the opponent does. You use this to get out of really, really tricky positions, like you're in the corner, the opponent's 1 spot away from you. Sometimes you want to have the threat of this online in a lot of matchups, just because there are so many different things that this can diffuse.
Okay.
You
So,
don't want the opponent to feel safe building up certain threats.
so basically, it's like what if I treated this as a full board Shoryuken? It's above curve everywhere, but also it dodges sweep in many board states. Like there's endless applications for just like safe 2 damage. But
Yeah, exactly.
the real upside of this is being able to say at any time, like even if my opponent is throwing out uh +2 speed, they might not be going fast enough to deal with Ride the Lightning.
Yeah, like
Okay.
if I'm in this position and I'm getting Hadoken spammed, boop boop, ping for 1 damage, solve the Hadoken spam.
Right.
Like just stuff that generally is speaking, you don't have solutions for most of the time. This is the solution for it.
Makes sense. Okay. Then
Uh,
how about Chain Trap?
Chain Trap is an interesting boost. The opponent cannot move. I can still move them, so I can still do the Mantis Strike where I pull them 2 and advance 4.
Right.
As an action, they can spend 2 force to add this to my gauge. So my worst case scenario is that I'm going to pass turn, and then they're going to pass turn, and I'm going to end up with an extra gauge, and they're going to have 2 less force.
Right.
And the best case scenario is we're standing at range 3, and I can play Firefly Gunner and get 6 free damage.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Everything that they would be doing would
Yeah, they can't move, so they
they can't
can't
move.
actually
They
get out
can't.
of that spot.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. This is a very strong effect of the opponent cannot move, but then being able to put it into my gauge makes it less strong, which means that unless I, for some reason, want this engage really badly, I will probably just hold this for the attack.
Interesting.
Again,
So it's like it's so strong that your opponent is just not going to let you have it, so they'll just put
correct.
it in your gauge. Okay.
Yeah, or they'll tech it. Like even though you have +2 speed on one of your boosts, they might just use a tech on this thing instead.
Okay.
Yeah.
And like the canonical combo with it would be Firefly Gunner.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
Firefly Gunner is nuts. Dive can also be pretty good in some cases, and just other shenanigans that you can figure out as you go.
Sure. Makes sense. I would love to be able to throw a spike out that my opponent can't assault underneath. Like, yeah,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
not hard to find a way to make this card scary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're playing against an opponent who just is all movement options and all their cards, then it's just all right. Cool. Discard 2 force to give me a gauge.
Right.
Yeah. Then finally we have Skies of Flame. This is a 3 gauge ult. It's 3 to 5, 4, 5, so it's a little bit overcosted for its stat line, but again, you have no issues generating gauge.
Right.
So it's actually perfectly fine that it costs that much. It's actually very fair in this particular kit. On hit, you gain advantage, which is fantastic. You can use this to set up for other stuff because the after effect moves you to any space.
Whoa. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So what you might do is you will play it whenever you think you just need to get out of some opponent's setup, right? They've played a bunch of boost and you're at, say, range 4, and it's like, okay, I can hit the Skies of Flame. I know I'm safe with that. And then I go anywhere that they're not going to hit because I don't have to know what card they're playing. I just pick the spot that doesn't get hit by what they're playing.
Right. And odds are, ideally this stunned them out, and I have advantage that will let me go to a space that I can threaten. But
Yeah,
if it didn't stun them, I can just dodge whatever they threw.
Yeah, and if I stun them, I usually want to boop ping them for an extra damage and set up a range 1 something or another.
Right.
Or maybe I'm doing something else. But it's a very flexible card.
Okay.
And then almost the opposite of the last card we looked at, this boost is insane. Preemptive attack. This is not the only character who has this.
Yep. Shout outs to Guile.
Yeah. You get
and Jin, I think, couple characters. +2 speed now strike is I can't imagine many characters wouldn't want this boost.
Right. And this contributes to the idea of Luciya being insanely fast. So she has this speed boost, she has the +3 speed boost on Firefly Gunner. So generally speaking, if you want to go first, you can set that up in some way. And yeah, +2 speed and strike is just flat out good. Opponent can't really react to it, and you just get to do what you want to. So if you want to hit with that see where is it? If you want to hit with a Talon Sweep, get that transform out.
Get that transform, sure.
Yeah. We're at range 1 over here. I get +2 speed. I zoom out of the way. I get that transform. There's no downside to that.
Right. And then just like with every other character who has this ability, putting it on your mid speeds, putting it on spike or dive is always very, very strong. But if I'm looking to like sort of advance my game plan, using it to confirm an otherwise unsafe transform might be a great way to do it.
Yeah, putting it on spike or dive is perfect actually.
Okay.
And you will want that boost, and the only question is where you use that boost to get the most value, because it'll always give you some value no matter what, basically.
Sure, yeah. Which is that's a good kind of problem to have.
Yeah.
So it sounds like holding Ride the Lightning to play it, or holding the threat of Ride the Lightning to play it, kind of the same way that you would hold Firefly Gunner over their head, is the play for this card. For this card, it seems like I need a pretty good reason to use Skies of Flame because preemptive attack is so good.
Yeah, using Skies of Flame, especially on your front side, is a little bit of a desperation move. It means that there's no other way you're dealing with that strike that the opponent just played.
Gotcha. Okay. And part of that is 3 gauges, even to a character who generates this much gauge. It's not a drop in the bucket, but mostly it's preemptive strike or preemptive attack being gone. Okay.
Yeah, you're losing preemptive attack, and that's the big thing.
Gotcha. All right. Am I ever? Actually, I answered my own question. Of course, I'm sometimes spending these ultras as force because then they'll go to my gauge and I'll be able to do all of this other nonsense with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and
cool.
you can So let's briefly mention dive, because I think you already brought that up. This is the one normal that interacts with her ability during a strike.
Right.
It now does 6 damage and gives you an extra gauge. So dive is stronger than before. Dive with a speed boost is very strong.
Right.
Just want to keep that in mind.
Sure. For the other normals, I mean, at a guess, I'm thinking that you might not need light as much as you would because you have so many other speed boosts, and maybe you are freed up to play sweep more easily. Any other considerations about, I could be wrong about that, any other considerations about like how to evaluate the normals and their boosts?
Well, if you've noticed something, none of your specials and ultras have any guard or armor on them.
Yes.
So if you're in a position where you like in this spot, you're kind of close to the wall and you're getting pounded on, you don't have a lot of stuff that's going to necessarily win unless you can play,
unless you can dodge with a mid speed or something.
Right, like you can dive out of the corner and ping for that 1 damage.
Right. Or talent sweep if you're really, really gutsy because you really want to confirm that. But it is a way to get away.
Yeah, so you are really vulnerable to just getting beaten up when you're low on resources, hand resources in this case.
Right.
Like you're low on hand, you're in a corner, and the opponent's just forcing you to wild swing until you find a good option. So sometimes you definitely want to hold on to like a sweep or a focus, so that when you do get in that situation, you have a defensive option and save yourself a little bit of trouble. Sure.
Okay. So and these are kind of like the classic defensive options of Exceed. So you don't have many others. Crutch on these whenever you can.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you can definitely crutch on them at range 1, because even if the opponent plays cross on their turn, they're just setting you up. They probably don't want to play cross on their turn. So you can usually kind of hitting with one of these.
Right. And also, I mean, like, you do have your get out of jail free card and Ride the Lightning.
But, absolutely.
But why would you spend it and the 2 gauge if you could get the same job done with focus or sweep?
Exactly.
Sure. Okay. So these are what you will use so that you can keep making them afraid of you throwing this.
Yeah, exactly. Correct.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
Right. And let's now look at the second character we're going to be going over today, which is the Firebird or the Thunderbird.
Hello. Wow. Okay. Hello, the Thunderbird. It's nice to meet
and
you.
This is a very much a season 2 thing where your Exceed side plays nothing like your front side. And in fact, this Exceed side changes so many interactions that it's worth treating it a completely new character, basically.
Okay.
So the first thing we want to mention is that when you Exceed, you add your entire hand to your gauge and you draw 5 cards. Okay. So the question of when you take the Exceed action is an important gameplay consideration because of that interaction.
Right.
Lots of times you'll have a lot of cards that work very well on your Exceed side in your hand, but if you take the Exceed action, you lose those cards and you draw a new hand. So it can be a little bit awkward.
Right.
And you generally want to exceed before you have the perfect hand for your exceed side. If you understand, you want to think ahead and think when you want to exceed before you draw that hand.
Right. And a lot of times when we have stuff that is like throw your hand away, get new stuff, you're talking about some characters have alter boosts that do things like that. Most of the time when you're doing things like that in Exceed, you want to do it at a very low hand size, so you're throwing away as few cards as possible. With Luciya, you're not throwing
They're
away;
all going to your
they're
gauge.
going to your
Yeah,
gauge. So, do you want a
yeah.
full hand, but just a full hand of kind of crap to put in your gauge?
That would be fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah, adding stuff to your gauge is fantastic. Otherwise, you can also use it as a hand reload. Like you spent all of your cards being very aggressive on your front side, and now it's like, well, I don't want to prepare. Well, this gives me 6 cards at the end of my turn and turns on this new mode that I might have already
Right.
set up.
And the sacrifice I'd be making there is that I wouldn't be getting a ton of stuff in my gauge, but that could be worth it
Right.
for other reasons.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the other consideration that's actually extremely important and extremely easy to trap yourself with if you're not familiar with this character is that you can accidentally trigger your manual reshuffle here. If you let's say that you have 2 transforms in play, it only costs 1 gauge to exceed. So you flip over, you have a bunch of stuff in gauge, you add a bunch of stuff to gauge, and whoops, I just drew through the last of my deck, so I reshuffle.
Right.
Well, now my deck is a lot thinner. A lot of my really valuable cards are still in gauge, and there's no way to get them back into my deck now.
Right, because you've already reshuffled and you don't have any
Yep.
sort of recursion or anything. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So that is just something that you have to think ahead about. Like if you're going to exceed with Luciya, and you don't necessarily have to, you can play on Frontside and win. And in some matchups, it might even be preferable to do that. But if you're going to exceed with Luciya, you need to think: do I want to exceed before I reshuffle, or after, or do I want to trigger my reshuffle with my ability?
With the ability, sure. Okay.
Yep.
Do you find yourself exceeding more often than not as Luciya?
The Luciya is flexible in terms of the lines she allows you to play. I play Thunderbird Luciya. I try to go Thunderbird every single match because I enjoy the way this side of the character plays.
Okay, cool.
All right, so to get into that, we can look at this new character ability we have. Whenever I spend a card from my gauge, I put it into play as a face-down continuous boost that reads +1 power.
Right.
So the first thing to notice is that I no longer have that gauge generation. I don't have that free ping of damage that gives me extra gauge, so I'm now expecting to spend all those resources that I built up to do this extra damage ability.
Okay, so I might, when I'm on Frontside Luciya, I might want to be just hoarding gauge the whole time to make use of the Thunderbird.
You might, and I wouldn't say that's optimal. Optimal, you want to think about how you can use that gauge to win with what you currently have, which means move actions or change carded actions and that kind of things.
Right, or your
But you do
ultras if
want
you
to,
need them.
but you do want to have a healthy amount of gauge when you make that exceed, because
Okay.
it's a lot harder to build it up when after you've made that choice.
Right. Okay. And you're gonna get a bunch of it from your hand probably, but
Yeah.
more is better.
Yeah, and one way to do that is have a big hand when you exceed, have transforms out when you exceed to reduce the cost, because it starts at 5. You can get it down to 0 with all 3 transforms.
Right.
All right, so this +1 power, that's whenever you spend a card from gauge for any reason. So it can be spent for force, or it can be spent to pay the gauge cost of your ultras.
So this
immediately,
just hits for 7.
yeah, immediately this hits for 7 now. Your
Okay.
other ultra hits for 3.
Right.
Just instant power boost for these. And some of these guys are playing this actually stat line you would see on much more conventional ultras,
Right.
even if it didn't have
the fly up, the move to any
yeah,
any space. Okay.
You can spend a bunch of force to change cards, and then suddenly you got a full hand, and you got plus power on whatever you want to use from that hand coming up.
Right.
Spend force on the move action. Whenever you spend force on this preemptive strike, that's +1 power now if you spend it from gauge. Whenever you spend force on this boost to move you from one side of the arena to the other, that's +2 power if you spend it from gauge.
Yep. And I remember you were talking about having grandstanding and having where is there
Yes.
it is.
Yeah. We have these 2 force
Storm's
interactions that
Fury.
happen.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so this could be when you initiate a strike, you may spend 2 force. If you do, move 1 and +2 power.
Exactly. And
Got it.
that's why Storm's Fury suddenly becomes goes from being a good transform to being a very strong transform that wins games for you.
Oh, and I'm sorry to interrupt. This isn't an action, is it? So I could
Correct.
do preemptive attack +2 speed. I'm now initiating a strike, 2 force from gauge. One of those could have been from another. The preemptive attack itself could have been paid for gauge as well. Move 1 +2 speed +3 power strike is a lot.
We got setups like let's say setups like this, where I'm threatening a lot of stuff and Ryu's holding on to that Hadouken to defuse a lot of my threats.
Right.
And I play that +2 speed, +1 power from gauge. Move in, +2 more power from gauge. Dive. And now he can't beat this dive, and it's doing 8 damage.
It's doing 8 damage. Stuns focus, just eat it. Okay, that's really scary.
Yeah, so
to be able to do unreactably.
You turned your dive into an ultra, a 3-gauge ultra.
Yeah.
Same thing with grandstanding. Grandstanding is now I can spend 1 force. I gain 2 power. You gain 1 power.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got a reason to do these things other than what's printed on them, as long as I'm in the Thunderbird mode.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And in Thunderbird, if you don't have these 2 transforms down, you keep looking for chances to put them down because they are just adding to your strength.
Right. This one you kind of don't. This one you mentioned
this
earlier.
One
Bug Zapper can go to gauge.
Yeah, this one goes to gauge, so you can spend it on for force.
Right. Makes sense. Okay. When I exceed, the gauge that I am paying for my exceed mode occurs when I am not yet exceeded, correct?
Yeah, correct. That does not become power.
Okay, darn. That'd be hype. If you just spend a bunch of gauge to become the Thunderbird and immediately get a bunch of power.
Yeah, that'd be a little bit too much.
Okay, that's a shame.
And this character's already very strong, so we don't want to give her anything else.
She maybe doesn't need any more advantages. All right, so basically, this sounds like obviously it's a mid to late game consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to close a game out really fast when I get here.
Yeah.
Okay.
My particular play style is I'm okay with having the opponent 10 life advantage on me, as long as my game plan is in place with these transforms and I'm ready to exceed, and then just deliver a couple of 8-9 power attacks.
Okay.
That just wins instantly.
And just win in a couple of strikes because like you said, you no longer have your front side ability to generate gauge anymore. You're like, once you go Thunderbird, you're kind of here for a good time, not for a long time. Like, the game's going to end pretty quick one way or another.
I want to have 6 gauge when I get here, and I want to spend that gauge in the range of about 3, maybe 4 strikes and just kill you.
Okay. Are there any particular cards that you really, really, really want to save? Not that you necessarily would be able to save them because you're pitching them in your hand, but are there any particular cards that you really don't want to have seen yet when you go Thunderbird, or can you kind of make it work with almost anything?
You can make it work with a lot of stuff, but I really want to. My favorite way to end a match is not necessarily the best way, but it's very flashy. You play the Skies of Flame, so that's by default it's going to be 7 power.
Right.
I'm going to play it at range 5, so I'm pretty safe. I'm actually going to play it at range 6, so I can spend I've got 2 force to move to range 5. I'm going to have another force to make that +1 power, so I'm actually at +4 power now.
Right.
And then I'm going to spend the 3 gauge, so I'm at +7 power, so I'm at 11 power. Skies of Flame.
Hit for 11 at speed 5. Okay.
Yeah, and just like, all right, I did that one thing. I can do one more thing, and then I win the game.
Probably, yeah. That's 11 is too high a number. So and because you can't really stack the deck, because you can't really, you can't hold options in your hand you can't have Skies of Flame in your hand, be like, all right, time to exceed. Right. You are either saying, well, hope it's not, I haven't seen it yet. Awesome. Change cards a whole bunch, get a bunch of power while I'm changing cards in order to afford it.
Yeah.
Or in order to find it. Or that's what you were talking earlier about how important your reshuffle is to trigger. If Skies of Flame was in gauge, get it out of gauge before you exceed.
Yeah, exactly. If I'm on my front side, There are two things I want. I either want this to be close to my opening hand and play it for its boost, and then it'll end up in my discard at some point, or I want it at the very bottom of the deck, so then when I do trigger my reshuffle on Exceed, I draw into it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
And if I don't have that, and I merely have, I don't know, bonus power on a on above curve defensive options or various other ways or honestly even just ride the lightning, like just easy ways to confirm bonus power, I can close a game out with. It's like instead, like if this is like
if I'm merely doing a power 7 ride the lightning, I mean that sure is a shame, but I guess I'll accept it.
Yeah, and obviously, like I'm not doing it for. I'm not playing Luciya to do that, but I'll accept it, I guess. It's like Luciya Frontside is death of 1,000 cuts. The Thunderbird is like death of like 3 or 4, but they're big cuts.
Yeah, Luciya Frontside is great for playing defensive and for punishing people who play defensive, because you can do little pokes and little stalling actions that give you more gauge and more resources and add a little bit of damage to them. And then the flip side is just great for finishing out games, and it's great for making aggressive characters realize they weren't nearly aggressive enough to kill you in time.
Okay, so that, and that's why, like, exceeding at a life deficit, it's not enough of a life deficit when you can do 11 damage in a turn, no problem.
Correct.
Okay, I gotcha. So when you are playing Frontside, you are building gauge with the intent of using it in your Exceed mode. Other stuff that you're doing along the way is maintenance costs, right? Like you're saying, yeah, I need to change cards here, so I will spend a little bit of gauge to do it, or I will do that little ultra recycling trick to ping somebody a little bit. But your goal is to have an overage of gauge for when you do this, correct?
Yeah, and the way I play Luciya, I always play for the Thunderbird endgame, so I'm actually not going to take very many stall actions. I'm going to be very proactive about trying to hunt down the cards that'll get me towards my goal, towards getting me these transforms, towards taking the damage I can put on my opponent while I can, and then otherwise playing defensive so I can survive long enough to get there.
Okay.
It's not necessarily the only way to play Luciya. You can actually play Frontside Luciya as your end game, where the flip is just a opportunity that you take if it shows up.
Sure. Does dedicated Frontside Luciya play basically look like the way that you play Luciya, except that they're being more not frugal. They're being more they're more willing to spend their gauge on Frontside for actual effects rather than just hoarding it?
Yeah, I think Frontside Luciya, you definitely want to do change cards more from your gauge, because change cards is already a very strong action, and just having the resources to do that at will can definitely make you play more aggressively Frontside, which is something I think that's going to increase your gameplay. You also want to be Frontside Luciya against very specific matchups where you need a range 4 speed 6 option, or you need something that pings them while you get out of the corner, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
I gotcha. That makes sense. Okay, so that's kind of the kit then, and it's got a lot of moving parts, and it might take a little bit to get all of her interactions down, but it sounds like the skill testing part is actually mostly resource management.
Yeah, it's well, you'll get a lot of resources. So if you're bad at resource management, that'll help a little bit. But you definitely want to make good use of those if you want to be the best Luciya you can be.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm trying to think of other stuff we haven't covered yet. So any other kind of like strategic considerations about how to run Luciya before we get into kind of some other administrative stuff?
Just think about the cards that are still in your deck. Those are a big part of your resource game. Think about the fact that you are typically have some very awkward ranges and awkward speeds, and so wild swinging can do some weird stuff for you, especially at range 1. Range 1 Luciya is fine, but you want to play cards from your hand, usually not wild swing.
Okay. It sounds like her preferred range tends to be in that 3 to 4 band, as long as she has the cards still in deck that enforce that mix up.
Yeah. 2 is going to be what I would call her weakest range, because you have Cross, and Cross always wins, but opponent usually also might have better stuff at range 2.
Right.
Range 1 is going to be very situational. It's either you want to be there or you want to avoid it. And then 3 to 5 tends to be pretty good for you.
Right, that makes sense. And you mentioned a little while ago the wanting to move from range 2 to range 1 to do a specific effect.
And that's specifically to do a +2 speed preemptive assault on your talon sweep.
Okay, yeah, that seems pretty good. Just to confirm that at range 1. Okay, that makes sense. So you were setting record time on this, which I feel like makes sense for Luciya being the lightning bug. Like, I can hardly call this excess exceed at this point. This is briskly paced exceed. So the final question I tend to ask is about counterplay. What are her weaknesses? How can you deal with her? And what should Luciya be doing to shore up some of those weaknesses?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've done if your character has good range issue, try to get range issue. She kind of runs in what she likes to do. Try to find ways to do score. Scoring usually percentage is most depending on what resolution she has. You really want to focus on what she has left. You want to pay attention to when she focuses sweep shot. That's your range reading on her.
Right.
You want to focus on what's the extra shots. That's that you take safe losers without being stretched mentally.
Right.
You definitely want to play short switch. Try to work on against things like that.
I see. Yeah.
Because keeping track of what's set and keeping track of what kind of options has changes, what it's trying to play less like. So
right.
That's going to be important for you.
If both Firefly Gunners are down, for example, that range 3, range 4 area is no longer nearly as scary for her opponent.
Yeah, both Firefly Gunners are down.
Sure. When you are when my opponent has like a parry or something, would I be looking to parry like sweep, focus, preemptive attack, sort of one of those? Makes sense. And not one of her transforms, crucially, it sounds like. Makes sense. Right. You could probably still. You don't need an EX attack or an EX transform to make this work. If you have some other speed boost or something, it can happen. Right. Sure. Yeah. You parry turn 1, parry turn 2, parry turn 3, reshuffle for your parries. Yeah. Maybe don't actually do that. Maybe there's a reason that I'm the host and not the expert on this show. All right, cool. So that's the kit. That's how you stop her. Any other counterplay notes that we want to mention?
No, I don't actually.
All right. Don't give away all of your secrets. It sounds like she's a character who allows a lot of flexibility and a lot of kind of range of playstyles. So my
serious answer to that question is you want to kind of play the person, but at least you can't play the character.
Sure.
If you're playing against someone aggressive, you want to find out what she's against them. More than you want to figure out what excuses. Because she doesn't have a lot of those.
Right. Makes sense. So my final question actually is maybe a little bit of theory crafting rather than something about the character in particular. So when Luciya was tournament legal, the competitive meta was some combination of seasons 1 through 5. Most of the time, my understanding is it was season 2 through 5, or 2 through 4, 2 through 3, like that band of characters. I know, Jay, that you have not played as much season 6 and season 7 Exceed, but do you have any speculations on how Luciya would do if she was just like time warped forward into a more modern meta?
Season 6 I almost know nothing about. I understand reputation is kind of an anti-censorship season, so you might play a little bit more heavily getting training use and just making normals that much better.
Right.
And not necessarily kind of dodging around things quite as much. But I can't say for sure because I ended up season 6.
Sure.
Season 7, I did my toes into, so I have I still with that last night. And I think if your guys is very experienced in season 7, it really changes the massive amount. They don't have quite as much score and whatnot. They're going to do a lot more take action, strike, like cancel type of thing.
Action compression into something when they're investing to change the board state. Yeah,
and so they actually become better at knowing the things that you do. You have less chance to kind of pass turn to them in a disadvantageous situation because if it's a situation, they can pull you into the strike,
right.
So you want to look for ways you can win on your turn without necessarily passing over as much.
That makes sense. So it doesn't sound like she'd be lost in those newer metas by any means. It just she would have to modify her play a little bit in order to in order to keep up with the pace, but she can keep up with the pace. She's got action compression all over the place.
I believe that she just fits my season 6, and I think season 7 might struggle with the top players.
Okay.
But I haven't actually seen the layout for sure.
Makes sense. And back in the day, my understanding is that Luciya was an extremely threatening character in her own right.
Luciya was the high of season 2. There's like 7 of 6 characters up there, so there's a lot of people who are very threatening.
Sure.
One of them for sure.
Okay, cool. So if she maybe she would not expect to maintain that reign of dominance in a modern meta without a little bit of adjustment, but she could hang. It sounds like. Cool. All right. So if people have the opportunity to play her in a legacy tournament, I'd love to know how it goes. That sounds like I'm interested to see what these characters would play like into a more recent meta.
I would want to see the current seasons get more development before we test that out.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that a lot of the sort of received wisdom about Seventh Cross characters, especially because they were in competitive play for so long, was against what that felt like, right? Like the idea of boost warring as a concept is something that really almost doesn't even exist anymore in Exceed sometimes. A lot of the stuff that enabled the kind of play that these characters excelled at is no longer in the game. So definitely interesting to think about what they would do into a well developed meta of season 7 characters. Well, cool. And then I guess the final question that I want to ask you, as I'm desperately stalling for time, so I can maintain that calling this XS Exceed. If somebody was really, really into Luciya back in the day, or maybe they're a new player who loves a certain character and wants to go back into Seventh Cross, are there any kind of like character commonalities that you can recommend? Like if you like Luciya, you might like this on another character, or if you like this character, you might like Luciya for this reason. Anything like that?
Oh, that's a great question. Is season 4 still in rotation?
Yes, it is.
All right, so season 4 is Propeller Knight, and he has a lot of those shenanigans that make Luciya pretty fun. He has a lot of good speed mix-ups as well, so that's a good option. I think season 5 has a good option to do that.
I think maybe like
season 5 has Bang, and he's got a lot of tricks in it.
Yeah.
Feeling very dodgy mobile.
I was thinking maybe like Bang, Lychee, maybe like Hazama kind of fits like little bits of that fantasy, but not nearly as much as like the kind of ninja archetype that Bang does.
I would say that if you like the idea of only for one specific play, in Luciya's case, that a lot of power is kind of
right.
Bang will have that build up for that one specific ultra.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then season 7, I've not played nearly enough to know what I would recommend in that case.
Yeah,
I mean,
my gut says Chip, right? Like that's the standard.
Yeah, Chip is probably, if you like your Frontside of just being very dodgy, kind of lots of damage.
Right.
It doesn't work at all
makes sense. And then anybody from back even further, is there anybody like Luciya in these earlier seasons, or is she kind of unique here?
Season 1, Lucia would be closest to. Um, you can have some differences. Ulrich has a lot of that movement stuff, but he hits so much harder. It's
Sure.
almost a different experience in that case. If you like just doing things that are blatantly unfair, they'll get for that.
That makes sense. All right. So yeah, we got some options. If you're into any of those characters, give Luciya a look, or vice versa. If you're a lapsed Exceed player who's excited about some of the more recent stuff, take a look at some of the characters Jay mentioned. All right. So any other comments you want to make before we wrap this up, Jay?
Always remember your special. Always remember to make good multiple choices, and whatever that means, I'm not sure.
But make them.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay. And if you find what they are, please let us know. Gotcha. All right, cool. Well, Jay, thank you so much. This was a wonderful lesson. I'm so excited to have talked to you about this. I'm looking forward to talking to you some more. Really appreciate your time and your expertise on this.
Absolutely.
And folks watching at home, thank you for watching. Thank you for your time and your attention. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. I will see you all for the next one. Goodbye, everybody.